Cold War is remembered for many things: hair-trigger nuclear arsenals, proxy wars fought across continents, and spies swapping microfilm in cafes. But one of the most, maybe my Cold War knowledge is just based on spy movies, but one of the most ambitious espionage projects of that era wasn't a daring agent or a secret weapon, it was a machine, and that machine's name was Echelon. At its peak, it covered the globe like an invisible net. It snagged satellite traffic, radio chatter, faxes, and billions of phone calls. Picture massive antennas in isolated fields, underground bunkers buzzing with cables, and satellites circling overhead, each node wired into a global system with a singular goal: to listen to the Soviet Union and its allies everywhere, all the time. Running this network was an intelligence alliance straight out of a Bond movie. The Five Eyes, the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand combined resources to build a surveillance system that would quietly outlive the Cold War. While the public knew about spy planes and agents, this spy program remained in the shadows, denied, dismissed, and whispered about. But the evidence really began to pile up. Leaks, whistleblowers, and eventually the Snowden files made it oh so impossible to ignore. Snowden was quite a big deal. You might remember him. Here's the thing. The project didn't shut down when the Soviet Union collapsed. It evolved into the surveillance architecture that still watches the world today. Have you ever Googled your name and then realized, oh, look, oh no, why is my address on there? Why is that my telephone number? Stop. How did you get this? Why is it out? I didn't give it to you, random data broker site. What the fuck? No, your information appearing out there, it's not magic. It's data brokers. They buy and sell information. It's what they do. It's not very nice, but today's sponsor, Incogni, is gonna help sort you out. You see, once the information's up there, it's really hard to get rid of. And that's where Incogni comes in. They'll find your information and your personal data from hundreds of these sites, and they will get it removed for you. It's hands-off. All you do is you sign up, they start clearing your info in the background. Super easy. And now there's custom removals. This is a new feature that lets you paste any link exposing your data, and Incogni's privacy team will manually remove it, even if it sits outside their usual list. Basically, you point, they delete. Ta-da! Fantastic. Your information's gone. Yes, please. Take back your personal data with Incogni. Use the code MEGAPROJECTS at incogni.com/megaprojects to get 60% off an annual plan. They can't harm you if you can't find you. And now back to today's episode. Origins of the Five Eyes. Now, to understand the scope of the operation here, we have to rewind to the Second World War. Before the Cold War, before satellites, before giant listening stations, there were code breakers hunched over desks filled with intercepted messages. In Britain, the most famous of these sites was Bletchley Park, where Alan Turing and his colleagues cracked the German Enigma machine. In the Pacific, American cryptanalysts broke Japanese naval codes, helping set up victories like the Battle of Midway. These early triumphs showed leaders something really rather important. Signals intelligence, or SIGINT, could decide battles and change the course of history. When armies moved by radio and fleets sent orders through wireless transmissions, capturing and decoding these signals often mattered as much as the number of guns and the number of tanks. Once the value of intercepted communications became clear, ignoring the data was just no longer an option. Britain and the United States soon realized that their cooperation multiplied their effectiveness. By sharing intercepted traffic and breaking assignments into manageable pieces, both sides covered more ground. Canada, Australia, New Zealand joined in as well, adding their listening posts and expertise. Even before the war ended, the foundations of an enduring partnership were already forming. In 1946, that cooperation was formalized with the UK-USA Agreement. On paper, this was just a simple intelligence pact. In reality, though, it was a framework that locked together the listening agencies of 5 nations into one machine. Britain's Government Communications Headquarters, or GCHQ, stood alongside America's National Security Agency, or NSA. Canada contributed through its communications branch of the National Research Council, later the CSE. Australia and New Zealand added facilities that could cover southern skies and Pacific waters. And the timing really mattered. By 1946, the war against Germany and Japan, it was over, but a new opponent had stepped into the role of existential threat: the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain was descending all across Europe. Stalin's armies were entrenched, and nuclear research was racing ahead. Western leaders concluded that defeating the Soviet threat would require eyes and ears in every possible theater. Traditional diplomacy and standard armies were no longer enough. They needed a permanent system capable of monitoring every signal the Soviets sent into the air. The Five Eyes Alliance, well, it became that very system. Now, this was never a ceremonial club or a symbolic pact. It was a living framework where code-breaking tasks, intercepted messages, and analytic duties were divided and exchanged every single day. Each country built stations, intercepted traffic, and sent it into the shared pool. That cooperation allowed them to cover nearly the entire planet. By the late 1940s, the stage was set. The wartime partnership had hardened into a permanent alliance, and the Soviet Union was the new target. The Five Eyes countries had the geography, the technology, and the willpower to attempt something extraordinary: the creation of a surveillance machine without precedent in human history. Echelon would grow directly from this structure, but its roots lay right here in the ashes of one world war and the opening acts of another global standoff. The birth of Echelon. So, by the mid-1960s, the UK and the US already had decades of experience sharing intercepted communications. Their partnership had weathered one world war and was now facing the long standoff with the Soviet Union. Intelligence leaders in both countries recognized a bit of a growing problem: the sheer absolute flood of information moving across satellites and radio channels was simply impossible to monitor with existing methods. Handpicked teams of analysts just couldn't hope to keep up with the millions of signals bouncing around the globe every single day. The American NSA and Britain's GCHQ decided to do something about that. They launched a joint effort to create a system that could not only capture signals at enormous scale, but also filter them automatically. In effect, they wanted to replace scattered manual interception with an integrated framework that could vacuum up traffic worldwide. By the late 60s, the technical foundations of this idea were taking shape. The formal program arrived in 1971 under the umbrella codename Frosting. Within this wider effort sat a new branch known as Echelon. At first, it focused on a very specific target set. Satellite communications were exploding in volume, carrying diplomatic traffic, military orders, and commercial data. Capturing and sifting through those transmissions became the heart of the project's mission. Soviet diplomatic cables, radar signals, and strategic military communications represented the highest priority. But once the system was in place, it began pulling in far more. What made Echelon different was not really the interception itself. Intelligence agencies had been listening to radio chatter for decades by this point. What set the project apart was its automation and its global reach. You see, the network linked together various listening posts across multiple continents, and it used computer dictionaries of keywords to flag messages that were worth analyzing. Instead of analysts sifting through mountains of chatter line by line, the system did the heavy lifting, pointing them to communications that matched specific criteria. Placing Echelon within the wider Cold War intelligence arms race helps explain its importance. At the time, the United States was flying U-2 spy planes over Soviet territory, photographing missile silos and air bases. After one of those planes was shot down in 1960, satellites became the preferred eye in the sky. The Corona program launched a series of spy satellites that returned film capsules dropped from orbit. It's a video for another day. These photographs revealed weapon sites and military deployments, but pictures alone could not reveal conversations or coded instructions. That gap was filled by signals intelligence. Echelon was designed to complement these other methods. U-2 flights and Corona satellites provided images. Human spies offered fragments of inside knowledge. The project supplied the voices, orders, and hidden instructions flowing through cables and across satellites. Together, these elements formed a layered picture of Soviet power and intention. No single program could provide complete coverage, but combined, they gave Western leaders a clearer view than the Soviets ever imagined possible. By the early 70s, the system was still relatively unknown, even inside many government circles. Yet for the NSA and GCHQ, Echelon represented the future of signals intelligence. It demonstrated that machines could capture and sort information at scales unreachable by human effort. The system would grow steadily over the next 2 decades, eventually expanding globally and involving every member of the Five Eyes Alliance. It began as a technical experiment in automated surveillance and ended up as one of the defining espionage projects of the Cold War. How worked the global listening machine? Now, this project was not a single base or machine. It was a sprawling network that linked together antennas, satellites, undersea cables, and entire huge facilities filled with analysts. Now, to imagine this properly, think of the worldwide funnel. Billions of messages, calls, and signals all pouring into this funnel every day, and it was trying to catch anything that mattered to the Cold War struggle. At its core, the intelligence platform had three main methods of interception. The first was satellite traffic. By the late 60s, satellites had become the backbone of long-distance communication. Military orders, diplomatic cables, and commercial faxes all passed through those satellites. Ground stations could tune into the downlinks, capturing streams of communication before they reached their intended receivers. This meant that an embassy call from Moscow to Havana or a Soviet naval order transmitted across the Arctic could be scooped out of the sky without anyone on the other end realizing it. The second method involved microwave relays and undersea cables. Microwave towers carried domestic and international traffic from one city to another, bouncing signals line by line across the horizon. If you placed an antenna in the right spot, you could grab that traffic in transit. Now, undersea cables posed a bit of a bigger challenge, but they were simply too valuable to ignore. Specialized submarines and tapping devices were developed to place intercepts on those lines, silently siphoning copies of transmissions without disrupting the flow. The third method was radio interception. Although satellites and cables were growing in importance, many military orders and diplomatic exchanges still just traveled by radio. High-frequency transmissions could bounce across continents. That meant a well-positioned antenna could capture conversations taking place thousands of miles away. Radio interception was older than the apparatus itself, but in this system, it was folded into the larger network and treated as one more stream of valuable input. Capturing signals was only half the problem. Once you had millions of calls and messages, how did you figure out which ones actually mattered? Well, this is where the dictionary system came in. Each listening station had computer programs loaded with extensive keyword lists. These included names, code phrases, numbers, and technical terms related to Soviet research or military operations. As raw signals came in, the computers scanned them automatically. If a message contained a flagged term, it was pulled aside for further review by human analysts. This made it possible to sort billions of transmissions into manageable piles, with the most relevant material rising to the top. Several facilities became legendary for their roles within the project. Menwith Hill in the United Kingdom was the crown jewel. Nestled in the Yorkshire countryside, the site grew into the largest electronic monitoring station in the world. Its distinctive white radomes, which are giant golf ball-like domes, you've probably seen them, not like protect antennas, and they became big symbols of Cold War listening. From here, analysts monitored satellite traffic across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. In Australia, Pine Gap, which I believe we have an entire video about, and if we don't, it's coming out soon, because I've definitely recorded it, that was located in the remote interior, and the base allowed coverage of signals from Asia and the Pacific. It was particularly valuable for monitoring Soviet naval activity in the Indian Ocean and Chinese missile testing further north. Its remote location provided secrecy, while its geography gave coverage that no northern station could provide. New Zealand contributed through its Waihapai facility. Though smaller in scale, it provided listening posts across the South Pacific, feeding data into the shared system. In the US, the Yakima Research Station in Washington state focused on satellite interception, covering traffic that spanned the Pacific. The United Kingdom's Bude facility in Cornwall tapped into undersea cables, giving access to some of the highest value transatlantic communications. Now, one of the oddest listening posts stood on Teufelsberg, which is a man-made hill of rubble built from the ruins of bombed Berlin. On top of this mound, Western agencies built antennas and radomes aimed directly at Soviet and East German signals. Teufelsberg captured Warsaw Pact military transmissions right across the Iron Curtain. Its location made it one of the most valuable ears of the entire Cold War. But all of these facilities fed their captures back into the Echelon network. The result was staggering. Billions of messages were swept up daily. Of those, only a fraction were ever seen by human eyes. But that fraction contained exactly the kind of material that leaders wanted: missile test results, submarine patrol orders, embassy cables, and military instructions. The dictionary system, it didn't guarantee perfection, but it made the difference between drowning in noise and actually pulling intelligence from the flood. Turning raw signals into actionable intelligence required another layer of work. Analysts would cross-reference intercepted communications with satellite imagery, spy reports, and open-source material. A Soviet radar test captured at one site could be linked with satellite photographs of the test range. A submarine patrol order could be compared with an acoustic detection in the Atlantic. Echelon was never meant to stand alone. It was part of a much larger puzzle, filling in voices and instructions to complement eyes in the sky and spies on the ground. The sheer scale of the operation remains really quite hard to imagine. Billions of transmissions, scanned and filtered every day across continents and oceans. Now, rest assured, no human workforce could ever have handled that quantity of data without the automatic filtering. For the first time in history, signals intelligence was happening on an industrial scale. Now, the Soviet Union had its own networks of surveillance, but none of them even approached the size and reach of Echelon. By the 80s, the system was running at full stride, antennas across 5 continents listening to Soviet communications in real time. Messages that would have once taken weeks to decode were now flagged instantly by machines. Analysts could respond quickly to missile launches, troop movements, or diplomatic orders. The intelligence platform had become not only a listening system, but also a central nervous system for Cold War intelligence. It gave the Five Eyes Alliance the ability to see and hear the Soviet Union in ways that few outside the intelligence community could even imagine. Inside the Cold War spy game, Echelon provided far more than raw data. It became a strategic force within the Cold War, offering a window into Soviet military plans, diplomatic maneuvering, technological ambitions, and clandestine conversations. Analysts at NSA, GCHQ, and allied centers combined signals intelligence with other sources to monitor all sorts of stuff. One of the project's top priorities was missile tracking. By intercepting telemetry and communications around launch sites, analysts could determine missile types, trajectories, and readiness. A listening post in Turkey, for example, monitored test launches from Kapustin Yar, a major Soviet rocket facility. That intelligence contributed to early warning systems and informed Western decisions on deterrence and force posture. Submarine movement monitoring was another area where Echelon offered a crucial advantage. The US Navy used underwater listening systems to detect Soviet submarines, but intercepted communications confirmed patrol routes and mission timing. In 1987, the Soviet Union launched Operation Atrina, sending Victor III-class submarines into the Atlantic in an attempt to outmaneuver NATO surveillance routes. Intercepted signals and supporting analysis revealed the movement of these submarines, turning an attempted surprise into a very expected maneuver. Political surveillance was, of course, equally vital. Echelon intercepted diplomatic cables, including cables between the Kremlin and foreign embassies, as well as internal transmissions revealing policy direction. These intercepts offered Western governments not just hints of strategy, but direct insights into Soviet planning and intent. By listening to embassies abroad, analysts could often forecast Soviet positions before they became public. Economic and technological espionage also became part of the mission. Monitoring communications involved research institutions or state enterprises, providing clues about Soviet advances in aeronautics, computing, and energy production. Reports of new projects or resource allocation were flagged by keyword detectors, giving analysts early warnings of competitive threats. Western companies also benefited indirectly as governments were able to anticipate Soviet priorities in science and industry. Now, the human element, of course, remained essential since analysts and linguists gave context to any raw intelligence, tracing patterns, and compared intercepted phrases with known events. Codebreakers unraveled encrypted communications that machines had flagged. Defectors occasionally confirmed interpretations, validating that a coded phrase meant an arms shipment or a diplomatic position. Without the human elements, Echelon would have just remained a noisy machine with no real understanding. So, let's look at some real Cold War moments, because these really illustrate the power of this network. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, intercepts of Soviet communications offered additional confirmation of missile deployments in Cuba. While photographs from spy planes captured the hardware, intercepted signals revealed discussions, instructions, and reactions within the Soviet command infrastructure. Echelon's role may not have been the headline act, but it provided pieces of the puzzle that shaped President Kennedy's response. Another example involved the Soviet submarine K-129, which sank in the Pacific in 1968. While much of the story is centered around the CIA's attempt to recover the wreck, intercepted communications and acoustic signals played a central role in locating its approximate resting place. Echelon contributed by capturing the Soviet Navy's frantic transmissions, which helped reveal the urgency and the scale of this major loss. Now, across all of these examples, the system operated at a massive scale. In every part of the Cold War, Echelon tipped the balance. It amplified Western awareness of Soviet actions, from missile tests to diplomatic negotiations. It did not replace human agents or satellites, but it complemented them. Its true strength lay in the way it turned invisible signals into actionable intelligence, shaping decisions at the highest levels. Now, the first crack in Echelon's wall of secrecy, that came in 1971. Perry Felwick, a former NSA analyst, chose to go public under the name Winslow Peck. In an interview with Ramparts magazine, he revealed that the United States operated a massive network with the help of allied countries. He described the UK-USA partnership with the global interception of communications, which until then had been virtually unknown to the public. For many readers, it was the first time they'd even heard of the NSA. His words sparked alarm, and they helped encourage lawmakers to begin questioning how much unchecked power had been handed to intelligence agencies. And then the subject faded from mainstream discussion until 1988, when British journalist Duncan Campbell published a piece in the New Statesman titled "Somebody's Listening." Campbell laid out evidence that Echelon existed as part of the Five Eyes intelligence structure. He argued that it was being used not only for military surveillance but also for economic advantage, suggesting that companies and industries might be targeted through signals intelligence. This claim set off debate in Europe and the US about whether the alliance was straying far from national security and into areas of commercial interest. By the mid-90s, another journalist pushed the story even further. In 1996, New Zealand writer Nikki Hager released a book titled Secret Power. Drawing on interviews with intelligence insiders, he described in detail how the system operated. He showed how New Zealand facilities capture communications, how keywords were used to filter them, and how the results were fed back into the wider system. For the first time, the public gained a clear understanding of daily operations, complete with detailed descriptions of listening posts and the technical process behind interception. His work transformed the project from a whispered rumor into a documented system. Governments responded as expected. Officials either denied knowledge or insisted that they could neither confirm nor deny the claims. Despite those non-denials or denials, awareness spread rapidly. Civil liberties groups began citing Echelon as proof that unchecked surveillance was not hypothetical, it was real. Public concern grew over the possibility that private conversations, business dealings, and political discussions were being intercepted as routine practice. Taken together, the contributions of Felwick, Campbell, and Hager forced Echelon into the public consciousness. Each built upon the other. Felwick revealed its existence, Campbell highlighted its broader implications, and Hager provided operational details. Their combined work exposed a surveillance network that governments had hoped to keep invisible, and in doing so, they helped shape the debate over privacy and accountability that continues to this day. Political fallout and European investigations. By the year 2000, the surveillance apparatus had moved from rumor to a subject of formal inquiry. The European Parliament, alarmed by repeated investigations and press reports, launched an official examination of the surveillance network. Lawmakers wanted to know whether the Five Eyes alliance was still focused on military security or if it had expanded into industrial and civilian surveillance. For 2 years, committees gathered testimony from experts, researchers, and former intelligence officers. Those voices confirmed suspicions that had once been dismissed as speculation. One of the most striking charges involved industrial espionage. Allegations surfaced that intercepted communications from European companies were being passed to their American competitors. Airbus, the European aerospace leader, was said to have been targeted, with communications allegedly used to Boeing's advantage during contract negotiations. A similar case involved the German wind turbine company Echelon, which accused American firms of gaining access to its research through intercepted signals. The evidence was difficult to verify completely, yet the stories fueled anger across Europe, and privacy concerns quickly followed. Citizens and civil rights groups asked whether ordinary phone calls, faxes, or emails had been swept up in the collection process. The possibility that private correspondence could be monitored by a foreign intelligence alliance created unease in democracies that prized strong protections for personal freedom. Politicians who had once ignored the rumors now faced growing pressure to respond. When confronted, officials from the United States and the UK maintained a familiar position. We cannot confirm or deny. This formula avoided both admission and denial. European lawmakers interpreted that response as an evasion, which only deepened suspicion. The Parliament's final reports concluded that the project did exist and that safeguards for privacy were inadequate, and the consequences were immediate. Echelon could no longer be dismissed as a conspiracy theory. It was now treated as an active system with worldwide reach. The European investigations transformed surveillance from a marginal issue into a subject of parliamentary debate and public controversy. Concerns over privacy, commerce, and sovereignty were now firmly planted in political discussion, and the arguments they sparked would continue long after the inquiry ended. The Snowden legacy. Then, in 2013, Edward Snowden's disclosures confirmed what journalists and whistleblowers had claimed for decades. The documents he released proved that Echelon had been real, and more importantly, that it had never disappeared. Instead of fading away with the Soviet Union, the system had adapted and grown. The leaks showed that global surveillance had not slowed but had accelerated, powered by partnerships between the NSA, GCHQ, and other Five Eyes members. The Snowden documents revealed programs such as PRISM, Tempora, and X-Keyscore. These initiatives demonstrated that interception had moved far beyond satellite and radio traffic. Undersea cables, internet service providers, and cloud platforms were now feeding information into the surveillance network. While the network had been designed to capture telephone calls, faxes, and satellite transmissions, its descendants were able to monitor emails, social media, search queries, even private cloud storage. And the scale dwarfed the original Cold War system. The core partnership between the NSA and GCHQ remained central. Britain offered major geographic coverage and legal loopholes, while the United States provided vast technical resources and global reach. Together, they could share filtered data at a speed impossible in earlier decades. Australia, Canada, and New Zealand continued to operate their own listening posts, extending coverage across the Southern Hemisphere and the Pacific. What changed most was the target list. During the Cold War, Echelon had concentrated primarily on the Soviet Union and its allies. After 2013, it was clear that the net had expanded to cover almost everyone. Governments, companies, journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens all appeared in the harvested data. The transition from focused espionage to universal monitoring raised questions that went far beyond military security. In this sense, Echelon's legacy was unmistakable. It had provided the model for automated global interception, and the logic of that system carried forward into the digital century. The concept of keyword filters, shared data pools, and industrial-scale surveillance lived on in the very systems Snowden exposed. The project may have started as a Cold War creation, but it helped define the architecture of 21st century mass surveillance. The machine that wouldn't shut down. Echelon deserves recognition as both a technological marvel and a cautionary tale. It represented the scale of ambition that defined the Cold War, when leaders believed survival depended on intercepting every possible signal. The urgency of that rivalry gave intelligence agencies the freedom to construct a surveillance machine of unprecedented size. Yet the system did not remain confined to that rivalry. It continued to grow, finding new missions and new targets long after its original purpose had disappeared. In the process, the network became a foundation for modern surveillance practices that now extend across the globe. The questions raised during European investigations have only become louder. So, was Echelon a necessary shield that helped preserve peace during the Cold War, or was it the beginning of a surveillance state that still struggles to balance security with privacy? That debate remains unsettled, and its outcome will recreate the boundaries of freedom for generations to come. Thank you for watching.